Y'all, Walleroo's been out for a few weeks. I've done PvP on every wizard, so today we're gonna be ranking every school from worst to best at max level PvP. It's finally tier list time. Without further ado, let's get right into it. We're gonna be starting with what I believe is number 7 at max level PvP. At the bottom of the tier list at max level PvP, in my opinion, we got Ice. And y'all, there are a lot of reasons why Ice is some hot garbage in PvP right now. For one, in order to use a shadow spell, you still need 25 accuracy, which is actually a pretty high stat burden for a school with such low damage. Every other school that actually gets pretty low accuracy, we're talking about Myth, Fire, Storm, they get compensated with tons of pierce, tons of damage, or even both. Ice really doesn't get that, and while you have to give up a lot of offensive stats to even hit that magic 25 number, you also need other accuracy for other schools that you need to survive because you can't keep up with other people's damage. So it really makes it hard to make good stats happen on an Ice. What's even worse is the things that Ice is supposedly good at, every school is better. You get better blade counters in Wyvern on a Death, you get way better weakness counters on a Myth than you do get on an Ice. Like, yeah, it's cool that you can do extra damage if there's a weakness on you, but if you're hitting through a weakness anyways, Stone Colossus is always better because you can literally ignore a weakness. I think outside of the stat problem, a lot of what Ice really struggles with is setting up any sort of meaningful combo that doesn't just revolve around Frostbite. This seems to be the only reason why Ice can even compete. You're not really leveraging weaknesses, shields, or traps like the school has somehow been designed to do right now. And instead, you're just doing something that's very low damage because of your stats. There's very little leveraging. Other schools get better tools for the exact same purposes, and your stats are worse in every way compared to every other school. It's like not debatable. I think Ice is at the bottom. Let's move on to number 6. I'd say that number 6 at max level PvP is actually Fire. Even though Fire is a pretty damn competitive school right now, every other school seems to just be a lot better other than Ice. Now, there's a lot of reasons for this. Your biggest source of damage output is overtimes, and overtimes are very easily countered by Kraken. That seems to be the gigantic reason why Fire can't really do what it's designed to do the best. And because Kraken is a pretty relatively low pip counter to overtimes that tend to be higher than 4 pips, you basically just struggle to keep up with the damage of every other school. Storm does more damage. Myth actually ends up doing more damage because they pierce through your resist, but you don't pierce through their resist. Balance has higher damage per pip with Hydra than even a Elephant, so they do more damage. And while Death doesn't technically do more damage, it can drain, which net means it'll do more damage. Let's say that I trade a Elephant with 1 buff, with a Wraith with 1 buff, I will lose that trade, even though this is doing more than a Wraith, because the Wraith drains. The only school that Fire can actually counter in this meta well, in my opinion, is Ice, which I guess is a good thing, but that's kind of one school out of, like, you know, the other 6. Every other school has really good tools against Fire and can outtrade Fire, which makes very little sense to me because Fire is supposed to be a high damage per pip school. Like, Fire has every tool it needs to succeed. It's just, in my opinion, the stats are just way worse, and the way you exchange spells is just never in your favor. Now, it might come to everyone as a surprise that number 5 on this tier list is Storm. I think Storm is actually pretty high on the tier list for once, and that's just because I actually think an offensive meta favors Storm a lot. This seems to be like, you know, a meta where Poisons, Frostbites, Basilisk, all of these overtimes are very, very powerful because you have a way of doing a lot of damage when someone shields, and you're gonna shield in a meta that's high damage. And you have the best tools against those, right? You have Kraken to remove protected OTs, you have Lightning Bats if you just want to get rid of an OT on you, and I think it's really worth mentioning that you really cannot outtrade a buffed Rusalka. Like, yes, drains exist, yes, heals exist, but if you really time this well, you're really, really good to go. This update also made its HP actually pretty competitive in my opinion. I think the only type of spell that just does way too much damage are trap gambits. I think if you just trap stack against a Storm, you're just gonna beat it because the health doesn't keep up. But it gets nearly 200 damage with like a good defensive setup, which is kind of nuts, and you still keep a ton of pierce as well. The big reason why it's not higher on this tier list is it's just a little too easy to one-shot it with like trap gambits and shield gambits, and maybe that makes sense. Those ought to be things that Storm is kind of bad against. Now, the remaining 4 schools, depending on who you ask, you might get a very, very different answer, but in my opinion, Life is number 4 at max level PvP. And you might think I'm saying this because they capped the amount of times you could regenerate and Pigsy. That is something that they did. That's what that ×1 means. But actually, I don't think this cap really changed anything. I don't think any really good players were needing to regenerate that many more times. I think if you really needed to regen more than 4 times, even in the previous meta, I think you were kind of ass. What's happened with life has nothing to do with the heal debuff. Damage has just gone really far up, to the point, I would argue, where more offensive schools like Storm, Fire, Myth, and Death can all do way better against life than they used to. Does that mean that if you go against an offensive school, you're completely dead on a life? Not at all. In fact, you actually have a lot of tools to deal with it. You have the easiest bubble control in the game because of Sanctuary, and you still have some pretty offensive moves in the form of overtimes, even though a lot of people don't tend to use them. I'd say a really good player can easily get to Warlord on a life. If they really know what they're doing and really practice their matchups, I don't think this is actually one of those schools that would be hard to get to Warlord on. I can't say the same about Fire, Storm, or Ice, so for that reason, this is number 4 on the tier list. At number 3, we got Myth. Now, honestly, there's a good argument for why Myth is at the very top. This is what I'm saying when I say, like, you know, it's up for debate. But honestly, I think Myth is just a little bit ridiculous, and that's simply because in a meta that has a lot of damage, you kind of are gonna want to be able to hit around debuffs, and Myth excels at this, right? If you weakness them, they can just ignore it with the spell. They can hit through it. And if you over shield, they can basically do damage through the shield by double hitting and then make more shields into traps. It's like kind of a nutty combo. So you're kind of forced to play with only blades and traps as much as you can against a Myth. Otherwise, you're just losing value on any move that you do, and that causes a lot of issues for any schools that don't use those specific things that well. I'll say this, I think something is a little bit iffy with Myth's stats specifically. It gets as much damage as Fire and about as much Pierce as Fire in terms of its stat caps, but its resist is like literally 13% higher than Fire. 13% resist is worth a lot more than the extremely slight Pierce difference and health difference that Fire gets in its favor. You also approach the damage of a Death, almost get to the damage of a Storm, and also retain 6 pip shads, which I think is kind of nuts. I think the fact that you still have 6 pips and 2 shad pips worth of damage the second you get 2 shadow pips, kind of nuts, especially on a school that's supposed to be based on not burst hits, but overtimes, Pierce, and resist, right? Like, these aren't things that really equate to burst damage, and yet Myth seems to have the tools to do that. And I think the other thing that a lot of people don't acknowledge, the fact that this spell exists is nuts, because against every other school, you might want to consider stun blocking, but against a Myth, you have to. That is a free turn of tempo that Myth gets, and they don't have to stun block against every school, especially if they're playing super aggro. So you're given a whole turn basically just in advance as a Myth, and your stat profile is really good compared to a lot of schools, and you have very easy ways to do burst damage. All of these things combined make Myth ridiculous. When this meta started, I don't think anyone thought Death was this good, but in my opinion, it is number 2 at max level PvP. Debatably number 1 as well, but the real reason is just off of this spell alone. It's kind of crazy that one spell can so entirely determine that a school is like incredible, but this spell outtrades every other card in game at its pips. Let's say you're a Death Wizard and someone sends a 6 pip hit at you. As long as you rate right back, you win that trade, because not only are you doing almost as much damage, if not more, you're also healing for half. It also has what I think still, in my opinion, is the best shadow spell in game, and it is also pretty easy to control bubble, because I want to say a Crimson Phantom is a very easy thing to throw out, and Doom and Glooms also still exist. I don't have my Brace Jewel on, but one of the big things about Death is that it gets a crazy combination of both damage and resist. They're very good stats to have, especially when you're draining with your hit. To be the second highest damage school with also the second highest resist is kind of nuts, considering that Ice, the highest resist school, has like no damage, and Storm, the highest damage school, has like no resist. You don't get stats like this on any other school. Finally, at the very top of this tier list, for probably, I don't know, the 5th meta in a row, maybe, Balance is easily at the very top. I think there's a few reasons why Balance is absolutely ridiculous right now. I think Shift is a very good spell, right? Right now, the biggest problem against shields is overtimes, because it's a high damage meta. A bladed poison, a bladed frostbite, a bladed basilisk. These are things that you are gonna struggle against on every other school. But with this spell, you can just swap it over to your opponent for way less pips than the overtime's worth and just absolutely gain value on them. Not to mention the fact that Mana Burn is a ridiculously powerful spell in a meta with high damage and high pierce like this one. And obviously, Hydra does an insane amount of damage. In case you guys are wondering how a spell like Hydra works, because it's an elemental hit, it's based on the damage per pip of Storm, Fire, and Ice combined. When you combine those, you actually get a number that's above the damage per pip of Fire. I don't know how the spell passes any audit whatsoever. I think you can make this 200 ahead and it would still be OP. I think you could reduce the echo, like, of the shields that this does to, like, way less than 35%. It would still be OP. This spell seems just broken to me. I don't really understand why it exists, but, I mean, I guess it gives balance something that, you know, is within school identity, which is using other schools. But yeah, this is a crazy spell, and I think this is primarily the reason why you can just out-damage most schools that play. It also gets some really, really good stats. It's supposed to balance out everything, so you do end up getting a lot of damage, a lot of resist, and your pierce isn't actually that low. It's still 54. So if you max out your stats, you're actually looking at stats that are pretty good compared to everyone in queue. I'd say the one major weakness of balance is that it's kind of hard to get shads while keeping stats like pip conserve, which you really, really need. So I guess there's one small weakness, but it doesn't compare to the well-rounded nature of the school or its insane damage output combined with its utility. That's the max PvP at 170 tier list. A lot of you guys have been asking for this. Hopefully y'all agree, or if you disagree, let me know what you disagree on. What school would you put higher? What school would you put lower? Let me know all of y'all's hot takes in the comments. As always, drop a like if you enjoyed, leave a sub if you're new, and if somebody hasn't told you you're awesome today, they doing something wrong. Stay awesome, see y'all soon, and yeah.